This voiceover is on intellectual disabilities, and I'm referring to the DSM-5 for this particular lecture. And under intellectual disabilities, the DSM-5 looks at intellectual developmental disorder. So you'll be hearing that term more frequently used. Something interesting that I also found in the DSM-5 is Rosa's Law, which actually was put into effect in 2010. And that law was to remove the term mental retardation in anybody's chart, in anybody's medical documentation or school documentation for that matter. So they're really trying to get rid of that word. And another source that I've been using too, there was actually more laws that were put into effect to get rid of the term mental retardation. And one of those laws said it was an actual cruelty issue, and so that law was also passed. I forget the name of it, but I know in the DSM-5 they refer to Rosa's Law. AAID is the American Association on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. That's what it stands for. This is an excellent website, www.aaIdd.org, and I have a link here that links you to it. Basically, before the DSM-5 came out, the AAIDD were really strong advocates for the diagnosis for individuals with developmental disabilities and intellectual disabilities, and they really helped frame that term that's currently used in the DSM-5. So there's awesome materials on this website. So if any of you find yourself working with individuals with developmental or intellectual disabilities, you'll definitely want to check this out. So when we look at developmental disabilities are severe chronic disabilities that can either be intellectual, physical, or both. Again, it's looking at the child's development, and so the child can be affected intellectually, physically, or both. Developmental disability is an umbrella term, and it includes intellectual disability. So intellectual disability or intellectual developmental disorder, I refer to them both interchangeably, is just one subsection of developmental disability. Developmental disability includes physical disabilities, so you may see somebody that has cerebral palsy or epilepsy, so they have movement issues, they have physical range of motion issues, or physical disabilities. They're not able to achieve those developmental motor milestones because of their diagnosis. So that would be somebody who falls under developmental disability. Someone who falls under physical and intellectual would be a combined diagnosis. So somebody with Down syndrome, they may have some physical impairment as well, like short stubby fingers, decreased grip strength, maybe low muscle tone, so they're slower at achieving those physical milestones, those developmental milestones, but there's also an intellectual component there, where they're not learning as readily as their peers. So that also would be a form of developmental disability, where again that intellectual part of the person is also affected. FAS is fetal alcohol syndrome, and Fragile X is another genetic disorder where you will see some physical and intellectual disabilities. The intellectual disability that we're going to focus on looks really on intellect or cognition, and this information is coming right again from the DSM-5. I really summarized it, so if you really want more information, you should go back to the DSM-5 if you want. But an intellectual disability is characterized by significant limitations in both intellectual functioning and adaptive behavior, and it must originate before the age of 18. And the new DSM-5 is saying within the developmental period. They're using that term a lot. So in order to get diagnosed with an intellectual disability, you have to have significant limitation in intellectual functioning and significant limitation in adaptive behavior. And it must occur before the age of 18. When they say significant limitations in intellectual functioning, how do we measure intellectual functioning currently? Pause for you to think. Currently, we typically use IQ testing. Okay, we typically use IQ testing, and in order for somebody to have a significant limitation, they're saying that right in the DSM-5 that somebody must be two standard deviations below the mean in order to have a significant limitation in intellectual functioning. Now, the DSM-4 talked a lot about that IQ test. They even had a range of scores, meaning somebody who scores from this range to this range has a certain type of intellectual disability. Somebody who scores from this type or this score to this score has another type of intellectual disability. And the DSM-5 got rid of all of that. They're saying that some people just don't test well, and they say use these IQ scores with caution. Okay, and actually they're saying that you can use other scores, other measurable tests, as long as they've met strong validity and reliability, and they're actually measuring intellectual functioning. So they're really trying to get away from that IQ testing, I feel. But since intellectual disability is looking at intellect and is looking at intelligence, they're looking at some way to measure it. The other thing is adaptive behavior. Okay, and we're going to go more into adaptive behavior later on, but you'll see that intellectual functioning again looks at intelligence, and it refers to our general mental capacities. So it's our ability to learn, it's our ability to reason, to problem solve. Okay, adaptive behavior is more of a collection of conceptual, social, and practical skills that people learn in order to function in their daily life. So again, adaptive behavior, you're looking at conceptual, social, and practical skills that people learn in order to function in their daily lives. Adaptive skills, the conceptual skills are like literacy, so people's ability to read and write, self-direction, any concepts of numbers, so adding, subtracting, working with money, the concept of time, all of those are conceptual. Social skills are those interpersonal skills. So how do we communicate with other people? How do we interact with other people? What's our social responsibility? What's our self-esteem? Are we able to follow rules? Are we able to follow laws? Do we know what's socially appropriate for us when we're in society? Practical skills refer more to our activities of daily living. Are we safe in our activities of daily living? Are we able to manage our own health care, our transportation or travel? Can we read, understand, and come up with our own scheduling? Can we use the telephone? Okay, those are practical self-care skills. They're assessed using clinical evaluation and individual culturally appropriate sound measures. Again, that's coming from the DSM-5. Now, the AAIDD website is coming up with a specific assessment tool to assess adaptive skills. And what they've come up with so far is the Diagnostic Adaptive Behavioral Scale. It's a standardized assessment for age 4 to 21. Again, it's looking at these adaptive skills with conceptual skills, social skills, and practical skills. And it's scheduled to be available in 2013. I looked all over for it, and what I found is they're currently seeking a sample size to work on the validation process. So they've come up with a test or an assessment with this particular age group, and now they're trying to get data to make sure their validation is right. They're saying that multiple professions can use it. Looking at conceptual skills and people's ability to read and write and numbers and time management, money management, social skills, self-esteem, looking at practical skills of self-care skills, being safe, working with schedules. That just screams OT to me. And so I really hope those that do end up working with this population really look for this assessment tool, because I think it would really be helpful for an OT to get their claws into it. But they are saying that social workers, teachers, psychologists, or anybody with a bachelor's degree should be able to administer this test. It will help determine if a child's eligible for services like special ed, maybe Social Security, community services, or even treatment in judicial systems as well. Here's a website. I'm not going to click on it because I don't think it'll work with the voiceover, but it will be on your handout, so feel free to click on it. If you scroll down the page, there's a video demonstration or video definition where they go over the definition of intellectual disability. And again, it's on the American Association on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities website. Again, a great resource. They have continuing education, they have resources, they have all kinds of really cool things on this site. Looking at the term MR versus intellectual disability, intellectual disability covers the same population that previously was diagnosed as MR. So if you're working with somebody who's been diagnosed 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago, their diagnosis is now intellectual disability, and it's covering the same individuals. Every individual who is eligible to receive a diagnosis of MR is eligible for a diagnosis of intellectual disability. Unfortunately, we still hear and we still see the term mental retardation. And that's why I wanted to bring up the actual legislation that is underway, or that has gone underway in 2010, actually. It's quite a while ago already. To rid that term. So as we go forward, I want you to be advocates and no longer use that term, and even correct people if you hear them using that term. It's no longer applicable. The DSM-5 came out May in 2013, and so it's going to be a while for people to start using that terminology within the DSM-5. The risk factors of intellectual impairment or intellectual developmental disorder, you're looking at biomedical factors that are somehow related to a biological process. It could be a genetic disorder. It could be an issue with prenatal nutrition or child nutrition. So somebody that has those issues or those factors are at risk for having intellectual developmental disorder. Social factors such as how a child interacts with their family or during social interactions. Maybe a child isn't getting stimulated as much as a young child should. Maybe the adult isn't as responsive enough. And so if that child's not learning some of those skills and not getting some of those social situations and interacting with their family, they're at risk for intellectual developmental disorder as well. Looking at behavioral factors that could contribute to intellectual development disorder, as if a mother is abusing substances, that could affect the child as well, as we all know. Educational factors are related to the availability of family and educational supports that promote mental development and, in other words, increase adaptive skills. So if you look at those adaptive skills, looking at working with money, working with numbers, those are all parts of our adaptive skills, and we learn a lot of those things in school, right? And so if we're not attending school, if the child's not attending school, they're going to be at risk for those intellectual development disorders. Timing of the exposure also contributes to the diagnosis. So when you're looking at prenatal exposure, you're looking at maybe chromosomal issues, you're looking at maybe toxins that the fetus was exposed to. When you're looking at perinatal, that's around the time of birth. You're looking at maybe prematurity complications or maybe some infections that the newborn baby is exposed to. And postnatal, so afterwards, you're still looking at infections, possible head trauma, and lead poisoning is a big one too with lead-based paints. So all those can contribute to the diagnosis of intellectual developmental disorder. A big change in the DSM-5 that I've seen is they break down the adaptive behavior skills or the different types of skills within each disorder category. So in intellectual developmental disorder, you can be mildly affected, you can be moderately affected, you can be severely affected, or you could be profoundly affected. So again, we've had those categories for some time. We've often called it mild MR, moderate MR, severe MR, profound MR, but now it's related to intellectual developmental disorder, right? And so if you're mildly affected, it could affect your conceptual, social, and practical skills. What you may see with somebody who has mild intellectual developmental disorder is their conceptual skills. A preschooler may not show obvious differences. However, school-age children and adults have trouble learning some academic skills like reading, writing, math, time, money, and they often show a concrete approach to problem solving. So they're going to be really black and white. It's right or it's wrong. Socially, they may seem immature in social situations, and they may have some difficulty perceiving peers' social cues. So any snickering or laughing that their peers may be doing, they may not pick up on that. And they may have some difficulty regulating emotions, so they may have a little bit more meltdowns than other kids. Some of their practical skills are looking at they may function, that it shouldn't say it should say may function with age-appropriate in personal care skills. So your dressing, your toileting, those types of things may be appropriate, but they may need support with more complex living tasks. So more complex living tasks may include grocery shopping, preparing nutritious foods, transportation, any specific home, or maybe even caring for a child, banking and money management. So they're going to need some help with some of these things. If they're moderately affected, their conceptual skills may develop slowly. Okay, children will still make progress with reading, writing, and math, and adults also make progress for that matter, but support's needed for them to actually implement or use those skills. Okay, so they still may have trouble. They may learn how to add 2 plus 2, but they may have trouble using those math skills in daily life. And that's what it means to, they may also to complete conceptual tasks of daily life. So they may need some assistance with that and applying those academic skills to their daily life. Socially, their communication is typically much less complex than peers, so they're not talking in as full sentences or as full complexity as their peers, but they're still using communication as their primary means of communicating. They're able to have successful friendships, including life, or throughout their life, including romantic relationships. So they may have significant others, and they may even have children someday. Caretakers must assist people with life decisions. Significant social and communication support is needed in those work settings as well. So if somebody's who's moderately affected with intellectual developmental disorder is going to need some assistance at work. Practically, they can care for their personal needs like bathing, toileting, and eating, as well as some simple household tasks like maybe sweeping or taking the trash out. Although extra amounts of teaching and learning is required if they want to be fully independent. And even if they are fully independent, they still may need some occasional reminders. So if somebody is severely impacted, conceptually, their conceptual skills, so their use of time, money, numbers, is limited. They have little understanding of written language. Caretakers must provide extensive supports throughout problem solving throughout their life. So if there anytime a major life event comes up, somebody needs to help them and walk them through it. Socially, speech may be used, or they may use single words or simple phrases. Speech and communication are focused on the here and now, so not necessarily in the future and not really in the past. Relationships with family members and familiar others are a source of great pleasure, and typically those people are very helpful. Practical skills require supports for all ADLs. They require supervision at all times. And skill acquisition requires long-term teaching and ongoing support. So they need somebody there long-term wise, okay, to constantly be teaching them, helping them out as needed. Maladaptive behaviors like meltdowns, getting aggressive, getting agitated, also including self-injury, are present in a significant minority. Profound looking at the conceptual skills, co-occurring motor and sensory impairments may prevent functional use of objects. Okay, so looking at tool use with eating, looking at tool use, checkbooks, time, money, clocks, calculators, use of even a pen or a pencil. Okay, that's going to be really, really difficult. Socially, they have a very limited understanding of speech or gestures, and they mostly express themselves through nonverbal communication. Motor and sensory impairments prevent many social activities, but well-known family and caretaker relationships are still enjoyed. Practical skills, they're dependent on others for daily physical care. They often have comorbidities, which impacts the ability to participate in ADLs and IADLs. They obviously require support of others. And this group also has maladaptive behaviors. They may act out, they may get agitated, they may bite, hit, scratch. They may also do some self-injurious behaviors also, and that's present in a significant minority as well. So that's kind of a summary of what is outlined in the DSM-5 as far as the different levels of support, and I kind of like how they break it up into conceptual, social, and practical skills. The AAIDD levels of support, they came out with these levels of support before the DSM-5, and I encourage you to use these levels of support when you're working with this particular population, because it's specific from the AAIDD. And they came up with these 3 levels of support based on what the client needs rather than what they lack, okay, rather than what they don't have. So if somebody needs intermittent support, it's support that's not always needed. It's provided on an as-needed or PRN basis. And it's most likely to be required at life transition. So maybe a child is transitioning from high school to a vocational or work setting. So here's where somebody may do some supervision, on-the-job training, and then do some intermittent checks at their job to see how things are going, see how they're doing and how they're performing. Doesn't mean that it's every day, okay? It's just kind of as needed. Limited, with the limited level of support, consistent support is required, though not necessarily on a daily basis. So it's still consistent, though. So it could be once a month, it could be once a week, it could be once a day. It could be Let's see, it says though not on a daily basis. So I take that back. It wouldn't be on a daily basis, but maybe it's every other day, or maybe it's once a week. And the support's needed of non-intensive nature. So it may just be checking in on somebody, checking on a client's apartment and making sure their laundry's done, making sure their bathroom's clean, making sure their clutter's picked up, their dishes are done or put away, just kind of doing some simple checks. Maybe it's assistance once a month balancing the checkbook, or maybe once a week you're supervising them shopping. Again, it's not intensive in nature, so you wouldn't be doing anything for them. You would just kind of be going along and observing and supervising. Now, extensive support is regular and daily support, and at least some of the environments. So maybe you're checking them at home. You're looking at daily home or living support. So maybe you're going in and providing assistance every time the client bathes. Maybe that's a couple times a week. Or maybe not everybody bathes every day. But this one, you are providing support daily in some of their environments. So maybe one day you look at bathing. Maybe the next day you're supervising them cooking breakfast, or maybe you are cooking breakfast for them. As an OT, I don't know if you would do it for them, but maybe you would recommend that somebody be there for that type of assistance. Again, it's extensive. You are having to provide a lot of the assistance that's given, and a lot of times as an OT, I would go in and I would assess somebody's home setup and home skills and ADLs like cooking, bathing, transfers, and those sorts of things. And I would say, they left their stove on. This person should not be cooking alone. I recommend that they have extensive support with all of their cooking, or I recommend they have Meals on Wheels once a day. And that somebody sets them up with breakfast because they're not safe. And so I may recommend more of an extensive support as opposed to me as an OT giving extensive support. And that goes for any of these. If I go and do a OT home eval, I'm assessing for safety. I could recommend that somebody get limited support or intermittent support with certain tasks based on their intellectual and adaptive skills functioning. So what can we assume? These are 5 assumptions essential to the application of the definition of intellectual disabilities or intellectual impairment. Limitations in present functioning must be considered within the context of community environments typical of the individual's age, peers, and culture. So what are some things that stand out to me in all that jumbled, wordy mess is I need to look at the situation of the individual. Being delayed in a small town in North Dakota, where the community is set up as being helpful, friendly neighbors that drop in on somebody that bring over leftovers or bring over food, somebody would be not necessarily exhibiting so much of a delay looking at their present functioning, as opposed to somebody who may be living in an inner city somewhere, let's say Los Angeles, where they do not talk to their neighbors at all, and they're unable to cook for themselves. How are they going to function? Okay, how are they going to function with that? So that particular context of the community is really going to depend on their functioning. Valid assessment considers cultural and linguistic diversity as well as differences in communication, sensory, motor, and behavioral factors. So when I look at this, I think, okay, somebody's culture, so that IQ test may not be culturally appropriate. Also, is it fair to give somebody a standardized assessment in English if linguistically English is a second language, or they do not speak English? They're going to score really, really low on the standardized IQ testing and show that they have an impairment in intellectual functioning, or adaptive skills functioning, when really they may not. An individual may have limitations, but those individuals also have strengths. So again, it's not on what the person can't do always, it's what can they do and how can we make that work for them. An important purpose of describing limitation is to develop a profile of needed supports. So even though some people may be limited in certain areas, if they have the right kind of support, they wouldn't necessarily be limitations. So if people are being helped out in the areas where they need help, they're not limiting them anymore. With appropriate personalized supports over a sustained period, the life functioning of the person with MR generally will improve. I missed that MR. I'm ashamed. So it should be with intellectual disability. With appropriate personalized supports over a sustained period of time. So somebody who has a cleaning lady, somebody who has Meals on Wheels, somebody who does the checkbook balancing, okay, over a long period of time, their life functioning is going to improve. So we can assume that. How do we treat people with intellectual impairment or intellectual disability? Unfortunately, there's no cure, right? And 80% of those who have intellectual disability have other problems. So they often exist with other diagnoses like autism, cerebral palsy, Down syndrome. And they have other motor and sensory issues like speech delay, vision issues, difficulty ambulating, heart disease, diabetes, anemia. Okay, those are some of the more common ones. Early signs of intellectual disability involve delays with meeting motor milestones, speech milestones, having feeding difficulties, being unresponsive to handling techniques, having a reduced spontaneous play, delay in fine motor skills, delay with perceptual processing and balance, etc. So some of those kids that you see early on with developmental delay, you may be seeing some early signs that they have some intellectual disability. However, typically they don't get diagnosed until they reach school age, and that's because we're looking at those intellectual functioning skills of math, of reading, of being able to learn. Okay, and typically those are occurring around the age of school. Treatment is used to teach the child skills to maximize independence. So as an OT, we want them to be as independent as possible, right? So we're going to do training with them. We're going to try and get their caregivers to treat them as well and trying to get them to increase their overall independence. When appropriate, we also want to provide supports to maximize their level of independence in the least restrictive environment. So based on how somebody learns, maybe they're just really struggling with handwriting, right? They're just really struggling forming those letters and copying those letters. And so maybe as an OT in the school system, we're going to say, based on their intellectual abilities, I just think it's going to help them if they just had some support with that. Facilitating developmental milestones, self-help, language and motor skills, educating and supporting parents. So what can we do to help facilitate development? Can we do different positioning techniques and 4-point positions so that they gain the strength in their arms, so that they are able to weight bear and eventually crawl? Okay. What can we do to help them be more independent with their self-care skills? Also with language, motor skills. And again, educating and supporting parents in how can they help their child attain these skills. Working with adolescents with individual or with intellectual disabilities, your treatment may be focused more on vocational interests because adolescents are at that age where they're getting ready to join the workforce. You may look at social skills, so what's appropriate socially for a teenager. You may also look at some sex education, as well as community mobility.